Uh, I'm Mahdi Shaheeb Sher. My website is www.mahdishaheebsher.com. One of my interests in the world as Mahdi Shaheeb Sher is kind of the Russia Federation, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, 1993. I think that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had the Russia Federation. It's kind of white, blue, and red flag. And I think with the Russian Federation, it does kind of follow on from an American Federation. Most federations in the world are American federations because that's where the word federation comes from. It comes from America. So we have the American Federation, and I think now we have the Russia Federation. And I think that's the number of federations we have in the world. But I think one of the interesting things about the new Russia Federation as a country is the situation it found itself following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Its poor conditions, its kind of bad infrastructure and buildings, its bankruptcy, the fact that it'd been conquered by America with the Cold War, it lost the Cold War to America. So I think it did find distressed conditions because of that fact, because of that loss, that Russia lost the Cold War to America. And I think as a consequence, it lost all of its tanks, all of its money. Most of its kind of people fled abroad as well, I think. I think its ideology in communism took a big hit as well because it was seen not to work. And ultimately, it's quite humiliating to have a vast empire like the Soviet Union being defeated by America of all countries. I think if you look at America, it's a very relatively new country without much in its arsenal or much in terms of its economy or infrastructure or intelligence or literature or art and history or intellectual thought or output. In fact, there is no American intellectual art or output, intellectual thought or output. I think that's what's striking about America, that America has very little intellectual thought and output. And at the same time, we had the Soviet Union with all of its ideology around communism, and it was ultimately defeated by America. It could have been defeated by Germany during the Second World War. It could have been defeated by maybe the Europeans or Europe. It could have been defeated by a number of countries, but ultimately it was defeated by America. And I think this takes its kind of communist ideology. It gives its communist ideology a big hit because it can't deal with it. But I think with this creation of the Russia Federation, we have a situation of dilapidation, delinquency, deprivation, poverty, and humiliation. I think those are the hard realities of Russia in the world as a new country following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So those are quite serious conditions, and it's a very serious, harsh winter environment that is being dealt with. Russia, even to this day in 2025, has an ostrich economy with its oligarchs. I think where most of the economies in the world have diversified. With Russia, they've done something like Russian billionaires and Russian oligarchs that are worth perhaps $100 billion each. And we have something like 50 of these oligarchs propping up the entire Russian economy and keeping it afloat. And if the economy is concentrated in a handful of oligarchs who kind of behave like ostriches, then Russia is pretty much condemned to a kind of failure in the future. If it doesn't have an economy, then I don't think it can do much in the world. But I think with this delinquency and dilapidation, Russia does have a problem in the world. And I think that the fact that it's struggling to function is perhaps the real reality inside Russia, looking in. I think when you look from the outside, it seems relatively big, but I think the reality is when you look in, it does have an issue of poverty and deprivation. And if Russia can't function in that reality, then I think there is likely to be further collapse with Russia. And I think that's the ultimate reality with Russia, that Russia can't function in the world because it's collapsed following the Soviet Union, and the risk is that it's likely to collapse again and again. I think if you try to have a comparison of the challenges it's dealing with, I think it's had to deal with some issues around organized crime, and that's kind of indicative of the type of challenges that Russia is dealing with. I think it's also dealing with things like social things, like poor family environment and the breeding, maybe with kind of like Russian brides overseas. I think that's how humiliating it is for Russians living inside of Russia. They also have alcohol problems and drug problems. Quite a few Russians have to go to prison just to survive and manage their households and families, and that's quite humiliating as well for Russians living in Russia, following the attainment of following the full achievements and attainment of the Soviet Union. I think for Russians living inside Russia, it is humiliating to have to deal with those problems, especially when we have full achievements and attainments of the Soviet Union, like space travel and Sputnik, and perhaps even Russian presidents in America, like President Kennedy. We've had people like maybe Marilyn Monroe, and we've had the landings of the moon, which have been Russian space technology. We've pioneered computers with the Soviet Union, and maybe mobile phone technology and the information age and the internet age. We've also kind of mobilized a high part of the world in a normal condition of transportation, accommodation, and food, and politics, and kind of society as well. So I think for Russians living in Russia, having to deal with Russian brides and organized crime and alcohol and drugs, and not having welfare money or jobs. I don't think Russians have jobs. I think they do something like play chess all day, because they don't have jobs. I think they do something like that. I think they have pennies to live on, and they have to survive in prison and go to prison for 10 years at a time or something. And I think these are the hard realities for Russians living in Russia. And I think that's why we have a problem with Russia in the world, and maybe Russian isolation in the world, and Russia isolationism in the world. Thank you very much.